That is very good. The swing works, the oracle again.
And the Yorker bowled in. That is out. Great theatre, magnificent drama.
First match of the season, eh, Howard?
First match of the season, Martin.
King Willow's on his throne and all's right with the world.
Gods and Flannelled Fools. It's from a poem about cricket.
Oh, very apt. How does it go on, my old Howard?
That's the only line I know.
Oh, but never mind, you certainly made the point.
Hello, and welcome to Gods and Flannelled Fools, episode 14, The Rise of the Subcontinent. This is the series in which I walk through a history of English Test match cricket, focusing on key series, matches, players, and teams of a particular interest, basically exploring the myths and legends of the game that collectively have led to how we view Test match cricket today. If you haven't already listened, my pilot episode, Brief History of the Game up to the very first two Test matches in 1877, is available, as well as the first 14 episodes in which I cover a variety of series, themes and individuals ranging from the early legends of the English game prior to the two world wars, through to the Bodyline series and Timeless Tests, and then on to post-war series of the 50s and 60s, and some fiercely contested Ashes series in the 70s and 80s. So worth checking those out on my channel. There's a Twitter profile for the series, at GFFpod, and I'll also make some notes in support of this on the blog, which is available at godsandflannelledfools.blogspot.com. So far on Gods and Flannelled Fools, there's been a lot of coverage of series against Australia and South Africa in the early part of Test history, and then subsequently coverage of various Ashes series and some of the contests with the West Indies. Now, I've touched upon the fact that Test cricket was something that started out with a relatively small number of countries, but this grew in a gradual manner, with West Indies gaining test status in 1928, followed by New Zealand in 1930, India in 1932, and then Pakistan in 1952. Pakistan as a country only having been created in 1947. Then there was a lengthy gap through to 1982 when Sri Lanka became the 8th test-playing nation. For India, Pakistan and later Sri Lanka, there was a great deal of what you might say cultural background and context to the game of cricket, as these geographic areas had been part of the British Empire, and the game had developed as part of this prior to their independence being declared. Initially, as with all new sides, India and Pakistan took a while to establish their presence in the game, to establish their identity, their strength and their depth. Now, by the 1970s, India had their first real star player in Sunil Gavaskar, an opening batsman who would go on to be the first Test player to register over 10,000 runs. They also had a quartet of spin bowlers, including Bish and Bedi, who, they would exploit the home conditions of dry, dusty pitches that offered very little assistance to pace bowlers, but a great deal of turn to the slower bowlers. And similarly, Pakistan began to find a number of talented individuals, including star batsman Zaheer Abbas and all-rounder Imran Khan. Now, really the turning point for Asian cricket was in the 1983 World Cup in England, where India found themselves in the final as underdogs against a very powerful West Indies team. And extraordinarily, they managed to beat them, lifting the third World Cup and their first trophy. And it really launched the likes of Kapil Dev, their great all-rounder, and Ravi Shastri onto the global stage. And the decade of the 80s saw both India and Pakistan improve their performances and become genuine test teams with greater depth and talent than they had before. And touring India for any team meant playing in front of huge, passionate crowds on turning wickets, whilst playing Pakistan often meant dealing with an unpredictable but often talented side who were capable of great performances at times. Now, as I've covered in the past couple of episodes, the England team in this period were on something of a roller coaster. Whilst the likes of David Gower, Ian Botham and Graham Gooch were genuinely world-class talents, team selection was a revolving door, and the setup and establishment at the heart of the game in England was erratic, to say the least. Now, this came home to roost at the end of the 80s, where against the West Indies they had 4 captains over 5 tests, and this was followed by a heavy defeat against Australia in 1989, where they lost the Ashes in what would start a dry spell of 16 years in the wilderness against their old enemy. And as the 90s arrived, the ECB attempted to drill new life into the side, with Graham Gooch being appointed captain, although the situation was not helped by Mike Gatting's rebel tour to South Africa, which took a host of top players out of contention, along with injury and loss of form to Ian Botham, and a much publicised fallout between Gooch and Gower. Now, each step forward, for instance, the heroic yet narrow loss away to the West Indies in 1990, the impressive home win against India the following summer, was offset by defeats to the likes of Australia and off-field problems as well. And many felt that this was part down to the uninspiring stewardship of former players such as Ted Dexter and subsequently Ray Illingworth as chairman of selectors. Their viewpoint on how the game should be played being somewhat out of date. In the summer of 1992, a 5-match test series was scheduled against Pakistan. And they had, of course, beaten England earlier in the year in the World Cup final, a match that many felt Pakistan were lucky to have reached, though they certainly stepped up to produce certainly their best performance of the tournament to win the trophy in the final. There was already a lot of bad blood between the two sides, and this stemmed back to the 1987-88 series, in which Mike Gatting famously rowed with umpire Shaku Rana over his intervention on field placements in one of the test matches, when Gatting had been signalling to one of his players and not actually adjusting the field during play. But this in itself led to a major diplomatic incident, which required intervention from both boards to settle things down. And the two sides didn't meet again until that World Cup 4 years later. Tempers had really flared once again in the aftermath of the World Cup final, given some of the decisions that had been made, and especially the way in which their bowlers had managed to produce such prodigious late swing. Imran Khan had retired from the game following the victory, and so the team were to be led on their tour of England by firebrand batsman Javed Miandad, not a man to take a backward step in any circumstances. His side was packed full of talent, with a very strong batting lineup, an explosive bowling attack featuring Wasim Akram and Waqar Younis, two quicks who really complemented each other, one left arm, one right arm, both capable of bowling at high pace, and exploiting a curious phenomenon of reverse swing, which was something where an older ball would rely on abrasion on one side and lead to the ball moving towards the shiny side rather than away, and crucially a lot later in its trajectory, making it far harder for the batsman to play. And joining these two was pace bowler Aqib Javed, together with leg spinner Mushtaq Ahmed, whose windmill action generated a high amount of turn. The first test that started in Birmingham on the 4th of June 1992 was a rain-affected draw, with Alex Stewart's 190 being the highlight. At Lord's, however, Wasim and Waqar both came into their own, taking wickets with fast reverse swing, their pace having a particular effect with the lower order, who were not quick to get in line with the ball and therefore couldn't really judge what was going on as it launched its trajectory towards the stumps. And it was notable that, unlike the West Indies, their success came with targeting the pads and the stumps as opposed to the body and the outside edge. In a close game, Pakistan managed to chase down their target of 138 with 2 wickets to spare. At Old Trafford in the third test, tempers finally spilt over. Now, this was the match that marked David Gower's recall after an absence stretching back to the Ashes series of 1990 to 91. And in doing so, he moved past Geoffrey Boycott's England run-scoring record with a typically graceful 73. However, it was Amir Sohail who stole the show with an impressive double hundred in the first innings. Now, the bad weather meant that the match would end in a draw, but not before both sides had a chance to vent their irritation, when on the fourth evening, umpire Roy Palmer gave a warning to Aqib Javid for bowling too many bouncers at Devon Malcolm. Now, Palmer's older brother Ken was also an umpire and had officiated in the fractious 1987 series, something that had not been forgotten by the Pakistani players, and they were perhaps not entirely patient with some of his younger siblings' decisions in this latest match. At the end of the over, Palmer went to hand Aqib his sweater, which got tangled in his belt, but the bowler reacted with irritation, which cost him 50% of his match fee. Although it must be said on reflection that Javed Miandad's remonstrations were just as forceful. And as Pakistan's captain, Miandad might have been expected to step in to calm things down, and instead he inflamed the situation, openly arguing and remonstrating with Palmer. Had Imran Khan been captain then, the whole situation would probably have been better handled, Aqib said afterwards. Their tour manager, Intikhab Alam, hardly helped either, telling everyone who would listen that Palmer was rude and insulting, and complaining generally that the umpires looked at the ball very frequently when Pakistan were in the field. The fourth test began at Headingley on the 23rd of July 1992, and here Graham Gooch found form to register a century, allowing specialist seamer Neil Malander to make inroads into the Pakistani batting lineup on a helpful wicket. In fact, this was a period where very often at Headingley, England would pick specialist seamers who would not necessarily last the course of the series. However, Pakistan continued to make complaints towards the umpires, especially Merv Kitchen, who failed to give Gooch out when he looked to be run out midway through England's first innings. And the uncomfortable atmosphere was made worse by the fact that the crowd was predominantly Pakistani supporters who gave abuse not only to the umpires, but bizarrely to John Major, the British Prime Minister, who happened to be a spectator in the stands. Despite the 6-wicket victory, England were really still struggling to deal with Waqar Younis and Wasim Akram's ability to get the old ball to reverse late, which meant that their lower order would often collapse quite quickly. In the final test at the Oval, with the series level at 1-1, England were unable to prevent Wasim and Waqar from blasting through their batting lineup, with Wasim taking 6 for 67, reducing them to 207 all out.
So, with the series level at 1-1, the final test at the Oval will be the deciding match in a volatile and fascinating series.
That's out, first wicket, and the poor stroke, all tucked up.
Got it quite safely, and Stewart is going to be very, very unhappy about that.
Oh, played on. And it crashed down on the stumps off the bottom edge.
Not much doubt about that. Wasim Akram has slipped through the defence once again. Pringle has gone. And this is high-class fast bowling, not just from Wasim Akram, but from Waqar Younis and Aqib Javid as well. Brilliant stuff. Beautifully bowled. Great Yorker, but Tufnell is in considerable amount of pain there. That was a very, very swift delivery.
Well, it was swift and it was swinging in right onto his toe. And it didn't get him out, but it's to be hoped it didn't do any real lasting damage.
Here's Wasim Akram. Malcolm used to be the batsman. And it's all out for 207.
With Pakistan making 380 in reply, England once again faltered, with Robin Smith's unbeaten 84 providing the only resistance in a score of 174, which meant Pakistan completed a comfortable 10-wicket victory, taking the series 2-1. England gained some ground with a comprehensive 4-1 victory in the subsequent one-day series that followed, but after the third ODI match, Allan Lamb revealed to a tabloid newspaper that the umpires John Hampshire and Ken Palmer had changed the ball at lunch during the England innings. "I've blown the whistle on Pakistan's ball tampering because they've been getting away with murder all summer. No one has been brave or honest enough to finger them until now." He went on to claim that he'd alerted the officials to alleged tampering. And a clearly blustered MCC secretary, John Stevenson, said the outcome of a hearing would be released quickly. And in reality, the remainder of the series was plunged into more ill-feeling and animosity. For his part, Allan Lamb was fined £2,000 and suspended by his county Northamptonshire for 2 matches, and then subsequently by the TCCB. And as it happened, he wouldn't play for England again, with the Pakistan series being his international swan song. In the darkness, noted Wisden, further seeds of mistrust and animosity were sown for the future. And it was certainly the case that future series between the two sides would continue to operate under a great deal of ill-feeling and suspicion, which has continued through to the present day. And at the end of the 1992 summer, England still were no nearer to gaining any form of consistency under Graham Gooch, nor did it appear that they had begun to evolve into a new era, with their up-and-coming talents being used erratically on a sort of in-out mentality on selection, often being used. And, of course, it was hard enough for the likes of Graham Hick and Mark Ramprakash to flourish in a side that was already on the back foot. And naturally, at this time, a number of the 1980s stalwarts were coming to the end of their careers, including Graham Gooch himself, but the approach of the selection panel really towards handling this seemed haphazard at best. And there was no better example of this than David Gower himself, who had finally come back into the side against Pakistan, averaging over 50 in the Test series, and who many felt would be a vital selection in the upcoming tour of India, being hugely experienced and a proven performer on difficult subcontinent wickets. But despite all this, he was left out of the touring party, and his place was handed to Warwickshire all-rounder Dermot Reeve. And his omission led to questions actually in Parliament and an extraordinary vote of no confidence in the England selectors by the MCC members, but this was held after the initial party had left the country and had little impact, with Gooch and the coaching staff preferring to prioritise hard work over talent. For David Gower, Ian Botham and Allan Lamb, then, the Pakistan series would be their last for England, which, when looking at their ages and the trajectory of their performances, especially that of Botham, one could perhaps understand. And yet, at the same time, both Mike Gatting and John Embury were selected for the tour, Gatting being the same age as Gower with a far less impressive record, and Embury being 4 years older. And many therefore felt that what this came down to was a feud between Gooch and Gower, the origins of which had started in the 80s, when Gooch was never truly established in the side and felt aggrieved towards the star names such as Gower and Botham. And this escalated during the Ashes tour of 90 to 91, when Gower had treated the series in his usual carefree manner, scoring a couple of magnificent hundreds in spite of taking a trip in a Tiger Moth during one of the warm-up games, often avoiding heavy practice sessions and partaking in visits to vineyards with the likes of Robin Smith and Allan Lamb. Now this, however, was one battle he was set to lose, with the puritanical England hierarchy set to press on with the boot camp mentality of Gooch. And consequently, both he and Botham elected to retire from cricket at the start of 1993. And though Lamb continued to play for Northants for another couple of seasons, he too was sidelined from the national team. When pressed on the controversial omission of Gower years later, Gooch was decidedly honest. "If I had my time again as England captain," he remarked, "I'd let David have free rein and let him get on with his batting. I left him out of the tour to India, and that was a mistake." One player who straddled both the 80s and 90s eras with some degree of success and who was comfortable in the company of both the old and new guard was Robin Smith. Like Allan Lamb, he'd been born a South African, and he came to England to play county cricket in the wake of the apartheid ban, and was then selected in the 80s against the West Indies, given his ability against quick bowling. Now, Smith had scored most of his runs against the West Indies, and in 1991 had risen to be ranked as the second best batsman in the world behind Graham Gooch. But he found the new regime particularly difficult, describing in his autobiography the psychological impact of losing his mates in the dressing room so suddenly. The atmosphere, he wrote, was one of criticism or focusing on what players could not do as opposed to what they had to offer. And while the rest of the world was busy selecting their best players and encouraging them to go out and play, the England hierarchy was preoccupied with politics and had no consistency when it came to selection or game plan. Now, the England team arrived in India on the 3rd of January 1993, with many confident of a series victory. New manager Keith Fletcher was especially confident that their batsmen would handle the Indian spinners easily, especially with the side having won their last tour there in 1984 and the previous series at home in 1990, when their batsmen had averaged a record 72 runs per wicket. That was, of course, Gooch's famous series. Fletcher had returned from a scouting trip to South Africa, where India had lost a dour series 1-0. His main purpose on that trip had been to assess the impact of their new star bowler Anil Kumble, and he concluded that England had nothing to worry about. "I didn't see him turn a single ball from leg to off," he said. "I don't think we'll have much problem with him." England would soon realise that a straight wicket-to-wicket stock delivery was Kumble's strength, with subtle variations in length and pace rather than spin, which made him deadly on slow, low wickets. And by the end of the series, England had 21 problems with him, each at an average of 19.8. It didn't help, too, that their preparation pre-tour had been on quick, bouncy mats at the Lillishore Practice Centre, with absolutely no resemblance to the actual wickets that they would play on. And this lack of preparation, combined with very poor selection, would spill into repeated disaster as the tour progressed. The first test began at Eden Gardens, Calcutta, on the 29th of January 1993, where India batted first with under-pressure captain Mohammad Azharuddin coming to the crease at 93 for 3. Unfortunately for England, he chose this as the very moment to regain his form.
India's way. Oh no, I think it was a deliberate stroke. He played it very late, running it down to third man, and a very delicate touch there. And that is Azharuddin's 50, and he'll be delighted. His job as captain has been under scrutiny, and he's really responded magnificently.
Azharuddin actually reminds me of the way he played at Lord's a couple of years ago, when he played some fabulous shots in between playing and missing a few times. And there's another fabulous shot. Straight down the ground. And how Azharuddin likes to play against the English bowling. Woefully out of form in South Africa. He's putting it all together today. It's all in the timing. Oh, and that's lucky, but it's 4 because the fortune is favouring the brave. Sumptuous shot by Azharuddin. I'll tell you one thing, this is going to be an education for Taylor. When you play in your first test match in a stadium like this, the atmosphere is one of your problems. There's a big crowd here loving every moment of this. Another magnificent shot from Azharuddin, so delicate. Like a surgeon with a scalpel, picks the gap, the ball rushes away. The 100 partnership is up, and India are 193 for 3. Suddenly finds himself short of men there. Azharuddin's all right with the hook, though. That races away for 4. Flashing shot again. There's no way anyone's going to stop this. This man is in magnificent form. Pierces the field absolutely precisely. 4 more to Azhar. That's it. That's going to race array for 4. Absolutely no doubt about that. In exactly the same gap that Jeff Boycott was talking about. But let's take nothing away from Mohammad Azharuddin. This has been a marvellous, marvellous 100. He's played shots all round the wicket. Mohammad Azharuddin praises his own gods. He looks to the skies in praise and thanks. As Jeff Boycott was just saying, he's a lovely, lovely man, with a lovely attitude to life and cricket, and this has been a feast of batting to watch.
Well, it's a super shot. He really cracks it away, you see. Gattin's not going to stop that, even if it went to him, so you might as well have a man for the catch. Splendid innings. As good a test match innings that you'll see. One slice of luck, and nobody really should begrudge him that, because he has played marvellous innings.
In reply to India's 371, England slumped to 163 all out, failing to avoid the follow-on, and then faring only slightly better in their second innings with 286, leaving India a comfortable 79 to win and take a 1-0 lead in the series. In what was Graham Gooch's 100th test match, none of the players coped with the pitch, but what followed was arguably even worse. Rather than to take it on the chin in his own contribution to this dreadful start to the tour, chairman of selectors Ted Dexter mused that smog was a principal cause of England's heavy defeat and promised a report into the effects of pollution on cricketers. If this wasn't enough, players began to fall victim to food poisoning, with dodgy prawns being spuriously blamed, and Gooch himself was declared too unwell to play in the second test that began in Madras on the 11th of February 1993. Here, despite also being sick, Robin Smith was promoted to open the batting with Alex Stewart, with Atherton dropped and the out-of-form Phil Tufnell selected. Tufnell was to have a really miserable tour, with his body language appalling, both on and off the field. As Mike Atherton testified in his autobiography, towards the end of the series, he announced, "I've done the elephants, and I've done the poverty, it's time to go home." During one tour match, he hoofed his cap and rowed with the umpires after being constantly no-balled, and then laid into wicketkeeper Richard Blakey when he missed his chance to stump Sachin Tendulkar. He was also fined £500 after a management meeting, at which those down the corridor could hear shouting and the sound of a bottle smashing. India won the toss at Madras, batted first and racked up 560 for 6 declared, with Tendulkar smashing 165 and Sidhu also making a ton. In reply, England fell for 286, failing to avoid the follow-on for the second match running, and then being bowled out for 252, despite a fine century from all-rounder Chris Lewis, and they lost the match by an innings and 22 runs. It was a particularly dreadful match for Mike Gatting, who was also suffering from sickness. As well as being run out when not even running, he dropped one of the simplest catches in the history of Test cricket at Scilly Point. And the catch was so straightforward that the umpire had raised his finger even before the ball had reached Gatting, only to watch it fumble as it slipped from his grasp. With the tour in disarray and the series already lost, even Arthur Daly put the boot in. "I mean, look at our cricket team," he said in an episode of Minder. "One man's bowl of prawns is a national humiliation." England's woes continued in the final test at Bombay, which began on the 19th of February. The returning Graham Gooch won the toss and elected to bat, with his selection changes seemingly paying off. Here, Graham Hick made his maiden test century, hitting 178 in a first innings total of 347. When Stewart and Mike Atherton, two of the contenders to succeed Gooch as captain, were involved in a run-out in the third test, many reported it as a sort of a symbolic power struggle between two opposites who didn't get on. But in reality, this was far from being the case. It was simply a mix-up. And in reply, India amassed 591, with Vinod Kambli making a double hundred. The fractious atmosphere in the England camp was best summarised with an exchange between Mike Atherton and Chris Lewis. And earlier in the tour, Lewis had bowled a fiery spell to the young Kambli and had remarked, "I can get this guy out any time I want to." And Kambli closed in on his double hundred. Atherton suggested now might be an opportune time. Set 244 to avoid an innings defeat, England started badly, and despite half-centuries from Robin Smith and Mike Gatting, they were bowled out for 229, losing the match by an innings and 15 runs, and with it the series in a humiliating 3-0 thumping. Their older players had failed to add much value. Their seam bowlers had had no impact on the slow, low pitches. I mean, perhaps this was best emphasised by Phil de Freitas bowling 63 first-class overs throughout the course of the tour without taking a single wicket. And despite Graham Hick making 100, the batsmen largely failed. And most disappointing of all were the spinners, with the insipid Embry being ineffective and Salisbury and Tufnell going for far too many runs. Aside from the selection and poor individual performances, so many other things had conspired to go wrong throughout the tour. The constant sickness that plagued the squad continued for the entire tour and extended to even the scorer, Clem Driver, who had to be replaced in his role by Dermot Reeve's mother. Travel problems from an airline strike meant that many longer journeys had to be completed by bus or train, meaning the side often arrived exhausted and dishevelled, leading to unfavourable reporting by onlooking journalists. And the tour was especially miserable for the England captain Graham Gooch, whose marriage broke down prior to departing for India, and this was announced to the players and media on arrival. His first test was his 100th test, but he was ill throughout and missed the second with sickness as well, and then returned home, missing the one-off test match scheduled against Sri Lanka in Colombo at the end of the tour. And after battling out a 3-3 draw in the one-day series that followed, England arrived tired and demoralised in Sri Lanka, where Robin Smith was promoted to open the batting when the test began on the 13th of March 1993. Despite his superb 128 in the stifling heat, leading him to change his shirt and gloves every few overs, England's first innings total of 380 was surpassed by Sri Lanka's 469, once again putting England onto the back foot in the second innings, where they were bowled out for 228, setting Sri Lanka a straightforward 142 to win, which they reached for the loss of 5 wickets, beating England for the first time in their history. The scorecard is noticeable for the best figures to date at that point by young spinner Muttiah Muthullitharan, though of course he would go on to become the all-time leading wicket-taker in Test history. To complete an utterly miserable tour of the subcontinent, England then lost the subsequent 2-match ODI series 2-0 and limped back home to face a review from the Test and County Cricket Board, in which Ted Dexter, rather symbolically of his nature, announced that he didn't like the player's scruffy appearance. "We'll be looking at the whole question of facial hair," he said, a comment for which he was inevitably criticised by the media. "At least," said one player in response, "we know we didn't lose because we played terribly." On the BBC Radio 4's Today programme, Gary Richardson pressed David Gower on whether Dexter should resign. After answering the question twice and pointing out Dexter had not been the one bowling long hops and missing straight balls, Gower was asked a third time. "For fuck's sake," he shouted, thinking his microphone was out of range. Sadly, it wasn't. The defeat signified the continued emergence of India as a world-class team, and over the course of the next decade, the likes of Laxman and Dravid would join Tendulkar in forming a superb batting lineup that would take on the best in the world. Sri Lanka, too, would go on to build their own success, most notably in the 1995 World Cup, as well as dominating on home soil, whilst Pakistan would continue to be a match for most sides with their strong pace attack. For England, however, these defeats would culminate in another Ashes loss in the summer of 1993, in which Gooch resigned as captain following the innings defeat in the fourth test, paving the way for Mike Atherton to succeed him. Unfortunately, though, England's performances were not simply a matter of captaincy, with so much wrong in the structure and stewardship of the game, making the 90s one of the worst decades in English cricketing history. However, along with the teams from the subcontinent, another team emerged in the middle of the decade, against whom England enjoyed some of their best battles, giving them respite from the succession of Ashes defeats and calamitous tours. In the next episode of Gods and Flannelled Fools, I'll be taking a look at the revival of South Africa on the world stage, following their lengthy ban due to apartheid, and some of the duels with England that followed. Until then, thanks for listening and subscribing to Gods and Flannelled Fools. Bye for now.